Общий вопрос, по
I'd
вашему
like to ask you a
мнению,
general question of
если
you,
подтвердится
in your
смерть
opinion,
Алексея
if
Навального,
Navalny's death
какие
is
последствия это
confirmed,
будет иметь, если
what
будет? Для
consequences
России,
will be
для российского
for
режима,
Russia,
для
for Russian
Путина,
regime,
ну и
for
для всего
Putin,
мира в целом?
and for the whole world?
Судя по тем
According to the
сообщениям,
news
которые приходят, это, к сожалению,
that we
трагическая
receive,
новость. Она
unfortunately, this
подтверждается.
tragic news is confirmed.
Трудно сказать, конечно,
It is hard to say
в чем конкретная причина смерти
what is
Алексея,
the real
потому
cause
что
of
доверять
Alexei's
тому, что
death,
говорит российская власть,
because to
это
trust,
было бы глупо.
to believe the words of the Russian authorities, that would be
Естественная смерть,
stupid.
или ее как-то ускорили,
Was
но
his death
совершенно
natural, it
очевидно
was
одно,
somehow
что
speeded up.
его убивали медленно.
What's clear, he was killed slowly, and no matter what the actual cause of his death is, the fact is that the exhausted person, after so much time spent in the isolated world, he was sent beyond the Arctic Circle in the winter. It shows us that Putin's regime wasn't really interested in keeping Alexei's health intact, and we may say that that was an intended action. And we can't say for sure, though, because everything that's happening in Putin's Russia is veiled. They show us only the things that they want us to see. And clearly, that this tragic news will disrupt the West. I just saw so many messages in my feed asking for interviews and asking me to talk about it. But the fact is that this interest will stay on top for 2-3 days and it will be over. I wrote on Twitter that President Biden used to say that Putin will pay a lot if something happens to Alexei. Well, President Biden, what Putin is going to pay? Because we've heard this statement so many times, Putin will pay if he attacks Ukraine. But listen, Putin committed so many crimes, and so far, I don't see this resolve of the West to actually punish these crimes. What's important to understand, while Putin is in power, crimes will continue. And everything we're discussing right now is happening against the backdrop of the war in Ukraine, and Putin is increasing the pressure. On the other side, we see a lot of words, but instead of words, we need shells, we need bombs, and instead of bombs and shells, instead of being proud that GDP in NATO countries is 25 times more than in Russia and its allies, so explain please why Russia has 10 times more shells than NATO. So I think that some events will happen, but we can't say much, because the system today is very fragile. I mean, the system of checks and balances. We don't know what's going to happen in the States, because we see that this whole story with the support package to Ukraine depends on these domestic squabbles, and we know which part has to do with real domestic squabbles and which part depends on huge Putin's lobby on the Republican side. So that's why we don't know, and we can only wait. And again, we need to say again that Putin's regime is a continuous series of crimes. So if this death is confirmed, and the West has to make a note of the fact that the most prominent opponent of Putin in Russia was practically liquidated before the eyes of the whole world. Does the West have political will or not? So this is a moment of truth. I would like to believe that in the West they will have a political will to finally speak about the changes in Russia, radical changes in Russia.
А как вы
But
полагаете,
I'm afraid
для
to
людей,
make
которые позиционируют себя
predictions.
как российская оппозиция
What do you think for the
путинскому
people who are
режиму,
positioning themselves as opposition to Putin's
эта
regime?
трагедия
This
сподвигнет
tragedy,
их более, может
will
быть,
it
решительным действиям? И
make
то же самое
them
касается российского
be more
народа,
decisive,
который
to undertake
сотни
more
тысяч
decisive
солдат
actions? And what
Путин
about the
уже
Russian
послал на
people?
войну, не погибли, мы видим это,
Hundreds
по
of
сути, не
thousands of
привело ни
soldiers
к
Putin
каким
sent to the
реальным
war, and we
массовым
can see
протестам,
that there
а
were
это
no any
событие
real
может быть,
big
вопреки
mass
логике, наверное,
protests.
может ли, есть ли
So
шанс, что оно
what about this event?
выведет людей
Is
на
it
улицы
possible
или
that
еще
this
сподвигнет
event
каким-то
will
любым другим формам протеста?
make people go on the streets and protest? It is hard for me to answer this question positively, because we have here a lot of unknown. Regarding the opposition, The tragic passing of Alexei Navalny from the political arena, it's a factor, because even being in prison, he was a symbol of the fight and the factor that they had to take into account. This event will inevitably radicalize their position, and these are the laws of political struggle, and blood always radicalizes, and we can see what happened in Ukraine, and this process cannot be controlled. And obviously that this death of the person of such a caliber, of such a magnitude, move the whole political structure to more radical position. Talking about Russia, we don't see protest. We see that hiddenly this process is kind of growing. So you'd say that Russia is not a scorched land, right? So what do you mean scorched land? So everybody is scared and everybody is intimidated. And people were thrown away, people put in prison. Yes, people are scared, people are killed, people are in prisons. But nevertheless, there are people who are against the war, and there were 15% who were morally against the war. So we had this people, we saw that looking at the rallies during the first 2 weeks when the full invasion took place. Some people had to leave, some people had to return. I wouldn't say that Russia's society today is hopeless, but what's obvious, there is no potential to dethrone the regime, and there is no potential for a mass protest. But for some reason, such events may actually induce something. The big question they're trying to answer in the Kremlin, where they're going to bury Navalny. And I think it is a conundrum for the Kremlin. According to their laws, they must bring him home and give his body to his family, as I understand, to his parents. And here anything can happen, because these events cannot be controlled by anyone. I have no doubt, if this funeral ceremony will be held in Moscow, we may see a number of people that will go beyond any expectations. So that's why it's quite possible they'll try to find other ways to do it, obviously illegal. Navalny's shadow is still a threat for them, and they'll be fighting that shadow even after his death. Regarding both Russia and the West, it is a new situation in which everybody has to make some decisions. Our position stays the same. The regime is criminal, and dethroning of the regime is possible only after the victory of Ukraine. And the victory of Ukraine is a step to freedom of Russia, so nothing has changed in my position, the position of my colleagues. Another thing is that this tragic news will increase the number of our supporters. My last question to you. So, you were quite critical about the methods of Alexei Navalny. With this news, given this news, what do you think will be the role of Alexei Navalny in the history, and how he will be, say, spoken of in the textbooks? We never know how our actions resonate in the history. I had quite significant disagreements with Alexei on many issues, but at the same time we cooperated a lot many years ago when I was still in Russia, and we took part in demonstrations and rallies and arranged them. But all this criticism today is very little, it's nothing against the backdrop of the tragedy, and the person died and he knew what risk he is taking when he was returning to Russia. When they asked me to comment on his decision to return to Russia after the failed attempt of his assassination, I always said that there is a political factor of any decision, and I may disagree with this or not, but you can't really comment on the act of personal heroism. Act of personal heroism is above of all political calculations. Navalny took this risk, and he paid the highest price possible. He paid with his life. And that's why I think all these critical arrows that they shoot at him, they won't reach him. He's kind of above all that. And I would like to repeat that Navalny's shadow is a huge threat to the regime. This is what the regime won't be able to cope with, because Navalny is out of their reach. And what he inspired with his life and death may become that very last straw to break the planet's tolerance to Putin's crimes.